Welcome to Fight News Now. I am John Pollock alongside Robin Black and J.R. Ramdeen as we are going to be going through all of the news from today. We're going to spend some time discussing Bellator because with all of the UFC cuts this week, the George St. Pierre news, we really have not focused a whole lot on Bellator 162 that goes down on Friday night in Memphis, Tennessee. Probably the most interesting aspect to this card is the return of Alexander Shlemenko. He was originally suspended for 3 years by the California State Athletic Commission for that enormous TE ratio that he tested for. He appealed it, it was reduced, he's coming back, and he headlines against Kendall Grove in a middleweight fight. And that middleweight division in Bellator becomes a very intriguing one with Chael Sonnen coming into the promotion. We know he's going to be fighting Tito Ortiz in January, but 185 is his home. Rory McDonald has cited an interest at middleweight as well. It's an interesting division for the Bellator organization.
Yeah, what I like though is I've always liked Scott Coker's matchmaking and his vision for the product that he has, because it seems to be very different than that of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And I don't know how focused he is on actual divisions opposed to just trying to get the biggest names, the most intriguing fights, and put these fighters up against each other. And that's kind of what we're seeing. Like, he's trying. You mentioned Chael Sonnen. They've announced that Tito Ortiz and Chael Sonnen are going to collide in January. But until then, these are the type of fights that you have. And Kendall Grove, one of the things about Kendall Grove that's very interesting, he's very, very, very close friends with the UFC middleweight champion, Michael Bisping. He calls this guy a brother. He's lived with him. He has so much faith in Michael Bisping. But you said you were talking to him on the phone, because I would have figured that Michael Bisping would have been able to get him back into the UFC, and he's content where he is in Bellator.
Well, he just signed a new deal, a new 6-fight deal with Bellator. He seems very happy there, cited the fact that you have a lot more freedom in Bellator. And, I mean, he spent this camp in Hawaii, but when he goes to California, he trains with Jason Perillo, trains with Michael Bisping. It's very lucrative for a fighter like Kendall Grove that a lot of fighters saw, or rather fans saw, through the Ultimate Fighter, through the UFC. He retains, I mean, he listed off a laundry list of sponsors that he would not have that option in the UFC. Bellator makes a lot of sense for a Kendall Grove. And to your point about Tito Ortiz and Chael Sonnen, I'd like your opinion on this, Robin. It almost seems like this superstar division they have of your Chaels and your Titos, and prior with Ken Shamrock and Kimbo Slice, you have these rotating names that everyone is familiar with, draw big numbers, and the wins and losses are kind of secondary to the promotional element and the pre-fight hype and getting as many eyeballs. And the winner or loser, it's somewhat important to fans, but realistically it doesn't matter, because then we take and mix and match these fighters that have a lot of cachet with the audience.
And I agree. That's what it comes down to. And it's kind of what mixed martial arts was based on. I don't think anybody cared back in the day how many fights Nick Diaz lost. All we knew is that when you paid X amount of dollars to watch Robbie Lawler, Pat Miletich, some of these, Pedro Hizo, Randy Couture, that you got your money's worth. They came out as warriors to put on a show. And I think that's kind of the angle that Scott Coker's looking at when he's booking these fights and he's bringing in top prospects. Whether or not Rory McDonald wins or loses a fight, you know what you're getting with Rory McDonald. Look at his losing effort against Robbie Lawler, one of the greatest fights ever, and he says it's one of the defining moments of his life.
I like the genius that's going on over here. I really do, because what is one of the reasons why you can actually always make fighter A versus fighter B? The biggest problem in boxing still to this day is you can't put together fighters that should fight except for once every 5 years. Why can we put these guys together? Is because the fans, we've built a culture where the fans get over a loss real quick. They get past it. Your next fight matters more than your last fight. And yes, people will zero in on a performance. And yes, Carlos Condit actually won a fight against Nick Diaz and still takes abuse for it. But Pollock, to your point about that superstar division kind of concept, think about if you're Kendall Grove, who in his own right has whatever we call star power, charming, likable, exciting fighter, interesting fighter. He has some name value of his own. If he goes in and beats Shlemenko, and that's a tough challenge, and he knows it, you got to go in and get yourself in a conversation about fighting Chael Sonnen. This allows a guy like a Kendall Grove or any of these guys to go, there's another level for me, another pay level. But I'm also happy for Kendall and for Shlemenko and everybody on this card. What a killer weekend to have a Bellator
no
fight
UFC.
card. No UFC for weeks. If you love fighting, you're desperate, and you get a good card this Friday night.
Do you think the UFC should have, when Bellator is putting on shows. Do you think this was intentional? Did they look at the UFC's calendar to say, hey, this is where we can focus, we can go big here? Because when I look at this card, it's not as big as it could be. Yes, you have Bobby Lashley on the card, you have Kimbo Slice's son making his pro debut on the card, but there's no...
On the prelims, no less.
On the prelims. So I look at this as you have an opportunity to go big, to make sure every mixed martial arts fan on the planet that's been starved for the last couple of weeks of MMA, you go big. Is this that type of card?
I think that's a great point. I don't think they were necessarily thinking that, but as you've seen, I mean, looking at the new UFC, a lot of people are expecting we'll get less cards than more in 2017. Look at World Series of Fighting and the decision they made this week that instead of running November 12th, the same day as 205, December 3rd, we're going to cancel those cards to build up December 31st. And I think that's a strategy all promotions, including Bellator, could be taking. Instead of this more, we have to be growing, we have to be producing more shows, signing more fighters. Let's get X amount of solid cards that make these event worthy and get all of that attention when you have a Friday night like this.
Every choice has advantages and disadvantages. That's why they're so hard to make. But once you make them, you go down that new line. Totally makes sense. I mean, except for the fact that it sucks to have less cards. I want more cards. I'm greedy like that. But
do you not feel this 3-week break from UFC? To me, it makes that November 5th card more anticipated. It builds up 205, and you give people that breather.
100%. But what else did we just touch on here? Bellator is going to get more people paying attention. If those fights weren't on those weekends that World Series of Fighting canceled, maybe they wouldn't have to cancel it. You know what I mean? Like, yes, you get the breathing room, but then you leave little openings. The art of war, the enemy can move in and they can take some of that real estate. So there's good and bad to both. From a obsessive fight fan perspective, give us more cards.
Also, I mean, in the wake of this past week and all of the cuts that the UFC has had, there are some big power players that were key in the development of the UFC over the past decade that you would assume there are some severance packages and some no-competes in there. But if you're a Bellator, if you're a World Series of Fighting, if you're a one championship, I am sure you are picking up the phone and at least engaging in some dialogue with some very smart people that are no longer tied to the UFC. Do you see them, reaching out and making that connection?
I would expect so, because it's one of the things we were talking about when it comes to Bellator and the UFC. It's just Bellator isn't even in the same realm when it comes to social media and getting their brand out there. You just look at the numbers. You go to their YouTube channel.
Fight Network's bigger than Bellator.
Bigger. It's just non-existent. So there is room for the Bellator organization to grow. And yes, you have some professionals that have been in the game. They understand.
PhDs in the fight game.
For sure.
And again, it depends on Viacom's commitment to the growth of Bellator. What do they want to get out of this product? What are they hoping for in the long term, for example? Are they hoping that this thing is going to grow, that it's going to eventually rival the UFC as being the #1 promotion in the world, or are they just satisfied being what they are right now?
Yeah, it's true. When I just said, Fight Network's bigger than Bellator, that was giving credit to Matt Lee and our entire online department, because what I meant was we have actually more YouTube subscribers than that organization, and we're not among the biggest right now. So that tells you kind of where they're at from that. But when you go out and you look into the world, you run a business, you're looking for talent. And we all think of talent as the next biggest fighter. But talent is also that guy who manages people really well, that guy who has an optimized system for buying and selling plane tickets for fighters. Like, all that is considered talent to business people. But whoever these strategists are in these situations, we can all go and research something and study how it's done. We'll never really understand. You don't understand how a bank works, and we never really will. But at the same time, one guess we can make is that when people make those, they take all these things into account. We need to cut X, Y, and Z dollars. Sometimes you cut them based on money. Sometimes you cut them based on impact. And in that variable is how much value is this person if they go out into the world to our competition. When Rory McDonald, you can't sign him, it's not just we want Rory, what would we like to do with Rory? How valuable would Rory be to our competition? That's true of the whole thing. That the business of running anything can be really interesting if you're interested in things from an analytical standpoint. A lot of times it has a lot in common with strategy for fighting, strategy for war, strategy for anything like that, because that's how business has shaped.
Speaking about World Series of Fighting, what do you guys think of this strategy of eliminating those 2 cards, and now their next event is going to be December 31st. It's an afternoon card, which is going to be on the main NBC network. They've had 1 card prior. They're going to have Justin Gaethje defending the lightweight title against Yaz Zaffarino. They're moving Jake Shields, challenging John Fitch, and kind of building that up. It's an afternoon card. It's the day after Amanda Nunes and Ronda Rousey. Most people are probably going to be at home at that point. It's New Year's Eve, but you're not putting it in prime time against everything else. If I'm a World Series of Fighting, I look at these risks as worthwhile to at least take, and you're on network television.
Yeah, I agree, and that's the upside is you're trying to get your product out to as many people as you can. And you mentioned Justin Gaethje. We were looking at the numbers, and they're all pretty much static except for the last Justin Gaethje. Was it the last Justin Gaethje?
It was a few ago.
And his numbers, his fights, people want to tune into Justin Gaethje. So the fact that he was out of this fight recently, you can save him and kind of piggyback him off of the celebrity of Jake Shields, for example, who fought George St. Pierre in Toronto, and John Fitch, who also fought George St. Pierre. If you're a mixed martial arts fan, you know who these 2 athletes are. And to add Justin Gaethje to the card, for hardcore fans, they know who he is. But if you're a casual MMA fan, tune into Justin Gaethje, and you are going to be a fan for life because that's just his style.
Yeah, he's an incredible fighter. And it only makes sense if we're talking about potentially the value of doing less shows, going and really trying to force these shows to work against the UFC. Instead, take all the best and put it on one and focus on that.
All right, you can always catch us here on Fight News Now, weeknights at 6 Eastern here on Fight Network.